Good evening. My name is Joe Kim, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to welcome you to the Education and Cognition public lecture, which closes out a busy day one at the 8th annual McMaster Conference on Education and Cognition. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our campus partners, including the McPherson Institute for Innovation and Excellence in Teaching and Learning, the Faculty of Science, the Department of Psychology, Neuroscience, and Behavior, the Alumni Association, and the Office of the President for their ongoing support to make these events possible. Introducing tonight's speaker is Dean Maureen McDonald. Dr. Maureen McDonald is the first woman to serve as the Dean of Science at McMaster University. The faculty is the largest at McMaster, with nearly 7,500 undergraduate and graduate students and 300 faculty members and staff. Maureen joined McMaster as a faculty member in 1998 after earning an undergraduate honors chemistry degree at Acadia University, her master's and PhD in kinesiology at the University of Waterloo, and holding postdoctoral positions at Western University and the University of British Columbia. Maureen served as director of McMaster's School of Interdisciplinary Science prior to her appointment as the dean in May of 2017. Maureen's research focuses on cardiovascular health, exercise physiology, spinal cord injury, and aging. With a team of more than 20 students, Maureen leads important research into the effectiveness of exercise as a way of preventing illness, improving health status, and lifestyle. Thank you, Maureen.
Thanks so much, Joe. I'm happy to join all of you this evening, and good evening, everyone. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd like to ask all of you to try to use the chat function here to make a prediction. Each year, the team at Merriam-Webster Dictionary announces the word of the year. Last year, the team chose the personal pronoun they. The expanded definition of the word they is more inclusive of people with non-binary gender identities. So, what do all of you think the word will be in 2020? Please, if you're comfortable, go ahead and use the chat and type in the word that you think might be the word of 2020. I'm seeing pandemic, coronavirus, unprecedented, pivot, all kinds of things. I have to tell you that my vote for the word of the year would be pivot, and Zoom might be a close second. We've all become experts at pivoting. Back in mid-March, the Faculty of Science at McMaster University, our 8,000 students and 300 faculty, researchers, and staff all had to pivot in the course of a single weekend. I expect that I'll be working from home until the new year. Our oldest son is still in his student rental out of town, so I converted his bedroom, where I am right now, into the dean's office for the Faculty of Science. The team who organized this year's EdCog conference did an outstanding job pivoting to an online event. It would have been easy to postpone or cancel this conference. After all, the 2020 Tokyo Olympics were postponed until next July. The Boston Marathon was canceled for the first time in its 124-year history. The Eurovision Song Contest was canceled for the first time in its 64-year history. And Broadway shows likely will not open at least until January 2021. Yet, the EdCog conference organizing team came through, and all of you have shown up in record numbers for today's events and tonight's public lecture. So I'd like to personally thank the amazing organizing team of Constance Imbault, Joe Kim, Michelle Cadieux, Paulina Rajkova, and Christine Kennedy. Thank you to all of you for pivoting. I'd also like to thank all of the cognitive scientists and guest speakers who are joining us virtually from across North America. Thank you for sharing your incredible wealth of research, insights, and your passion for teaching and learning during our conference. I now have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for tonight's public lecture. Dr. Fiona Rawle holds a PhD in pathology and molecular medicine. She's the Associate Dean Undergraduate at the University of Toronto's Mississauga and an Associate Professor teaching stream in the Department of Biology. Fiona's research focuses on public communication of science, the science of learning, and resilience-based learning. Fiona has received numerous awards focused on teaching, including the University of Toronto's President's Teaching Award. Fiona is also a member of U of T's TIDE group, which stands for the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence. As a member of that group, Fiona gives lectures and workshops on unconscious bias, equity, and diversity. Dr. Rawle, welcome to EdCog 2020, and the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. Before we start on this topic, I just want to take a second and acknowledge the land where this work has taken place. I know that we come from all over North America to be here tonight. In the workshops today, I was talking to people from the West Coast, the East Coast, the Southern Coast of the United States. So I'm at the University of Toronto Mississauga, and I want to acknowledge the land on which U of T operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And today it is a meeting place that is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to work here on this land. Today we're going to be talking about academic resilience and how we could foster it. I'm going to be sharing some research with you, but I'm also going to be pulling examples from the public. There's a lot of people on this call with different backgrounds. We received some emails today from parents saying, are you going to be saying anything that will be relevant to parenting toddlers or parenting teenagers, for example? So what exactly is academic resilience? Another term for it could be academic buoyancy. Some people use the word grit to describe resilience. Grit has become a little bit problematic. Of late, there's some research coming out of elementary and secondary schools saying that grit can sometimes blame the individual if they don't succeed. Oh, if only you had enough grit, you would have succeeded. So I just want to talk about how I define resilience. So I define resilience as acknowledging challenges, acknowledging that there's going to be setbacks, engaging in them, learning from them, and applying what we learn. We are also going to be talking about evidence-based medicine. I'd like to start by talking about this because it relates to evidence-based practice in teaching, and I think it's a good analogy. So what evidence-based medicine is, it's the purposeful, reasonable use of the best evidence we have to make decisions for our healthcare, and it's based on data, clinical trials, clinical experience, patient values, and it's a decision-making tool. The BMJ, the British Medical Journal, recently called evidence-based medicine one of the most important milestones since the journal began, and it was really took form in the 80s. There's lots of examples we could talk about evidence-based medicine. So there was a clinical trial at Harvard in the early 1980s. Thousands of men were enrolled, and that was the trial that gave evidence that taking an aspirin prevents heart attacks, in men at least. Criticism of that trial is that there weren't any women involved, but it still provided valuable evidence for aspirin preventing heart attacks. Putting ice on an injury to reduce swelling is an example of evidence-based medicine. Use of vaccinations to prevent infectious disease. There are many other examples, and we could have a whole lecture on what's not evidence-based medicine that falls into the realm of pseudoscience. Things like homeopathy, which is based on the idea that whatever makes you sick will cure you if you dilute it a lot. So this is taking evidence and using evidence to make good decisions for healthcare. We want to do the same with pedagogy and with educational practice. We want to take evidence from science of learning, educational psychology, cognitive psychology studies, and use that evidence to make good choices about course design and student learning. So what is that evidence? What do we know about the science of learning, and how can it inform our actions? So to get into talking about some things we know about science of learning, we need to acknowledge some myths. There are some learning myths that just perpetuate in society, even though it's been shown again and again that they don't exist or they don't help with learning. Nature came out of the top 10 myths that just won't die, and this one was in their top 10 list, and that's learning styles. There is no evidence that learning styles exist. We might have a learning preference where we enjoy learning a certain way. It doesn't mean that we actually learn better. As humans, we all learn better by doing. We all learn better visually and by doing. So just because we have a preference doesn't mean we actually learn better. Another myth is multitasking. Multitasking does not work. We end up doing many things poorly. And there is some early data showing that multitasking makes failure more likely, but decreases the chance you're going to learn from that failure. So if we're talking about learning from failure, we can't be multitasking when we're engaging in that failure. And this one's really common online, that we only use 10% of our brain. That's not accurate. In terms of evidence-based practice, testing effect, retrieval practice. So Bjork, who's a cognitive scientist who has published a lot on retrieval practice, refers to this as a memory modifier, the sense that retrieving information strengthens the information. Taking tests without peeking will help you to strengthen that information. Another evidence-based practice is spacing. Spacing your study out, so you have breaks in between, can lead to greater learning and greater recall later on. Another is interleaving. So if you have a lot of things to study, instead of studying only one thing on Monday, another thing on Tuesday, and another thing on Wednesday, interleaving these different topics together can lead to greater learning. And across the science of learning literature, there's this trend that methods that improve learning often make it seem like the learning is harder. So from the student's perspective, it seems harder. We know that fast and easy doesn't work, but this is often what some students might want, is a fast and easy approach. Bjork, as I mentioned, has published a lot on desirable difficulties. If something is difficult, we learn it better, and it requires more effort to learn. Learning should be hard. And students could put desirable difficulties right into their own study practice. It doesn't just have to be in the classroom. By testing with no peeking, that could be a form of a desirable difficulty. By approaching a topic from different directions at different levels of difficulty, that could also be a desirable difficulty. But part of that too is that we need to get students and ourselves as professors to be metacognitive about their approach, to be aware of their learning, what works and what doesn't. So to have this self-reflection and self-monitoring. So what do we know and what do we not know about failure? If we're talking about failure-based learning or learning from failure or decreasing the stigma of failure, we need to bring information together from many different disciplines. It's a huge knowledge translation effort. So you have educational and cognitive psychology, you have science of learning, you have trauma-aware teaching. There's principles from all of these things that we need to bring together. And what a group that I'm a part of does is that we take these ideas and this research that's come from other disciplines, and we try to apply it to the classroom and then test it to see how effective it is. We look at research on growth mindset. How do we create a growth mindset or help our students achieve a growth mindset in a large class? If you have 1,000 students, how do you do this meaningfully with each student? We know that students come to class with mental models. How do we help them correct their prior mental models to build new mental models that align with material? How do we help them overcome misconceptions? Another area of research is on productive failure. This is research about purposely introducing difficulties or errors or unsolvable problems and how that can increase learning. And it can help students generate more pathways to the right answer. There's not just one pathway. So if we're having a discussion about failure, we can't talk about failure without also talking about risk and fear. Engaging in failure repeatedly means engaging in taking a risk. It means overcoming fear and stigma of failure. We also need to talk about motivation and curiosity. There's some popular writings about how we get less curious as we age. Toddlers are so curious and always falling down and always getting into trouble, and adults seem to be less curious. But some of the research that's come out over the past 10 years shows that we actually don't get less curious. We just get a lot more risk adverse. And toddlers are less risk adverse than we are as adults. There's a lot of information about curiosity and how important it is for learning. If a student is primed and curious about a lecture that they're going into, they're more likely to recall that information. They're more likely to be engaged during the lecture, and they're more likely to want to come back. So creating genuine curiosity in students before some of these failure activities. And then we also need to talk about procrastination and perfectionism. There is literature showing that these two things go hand in hand, and there are students who rate themselves very highly on procrastination metrics and on perfectionism metrics, and they don't want to start something. They'll wait to start something until they know they can get it perfect. This definitely reminds me of myself when I was in first and second year, and I really had to work at overcoming that, especially in terms of writing essays when I didn't know exactly what it was going to look like at the end. One thing about taking risks and being open to failure is that it will lead to all of these incredible accidents that lead to inventions. If we don't take risks and we're not open to failure, there'll be fewer accidental inventions, like penicillin, for example. There's just a comment in the chat about minimizing captioning. You could take a piece of paper if you want to cover it. The captioning comes from our end so that you can't turn it off. We just have it for universal design and accessibility options. Thank you for asking that. For those of you who are on the call, you can enter into the chat anytime, or you can post to the Q&A. I want to highlight two accidents. Does anyone know what this little blue pill is? Type in the chat if you know what this blue pill is. So a bunch of people are commenting. Yes, so this is the pharmaceutical product Viagra, and this is actually an example of an accident. So the researchers who discovered Viagra, they weren't actually looking for it. So there's an active ingredient in it that was originally developed to target cardiovascular problems. And it blocks a specific protein. It's called PDE5, but you don't need to memorize that. It blocks a specific protein. And when they did animal tests, it blocked that protein really well. So they went into human trials. And what they found was that the nurses found that the men who were in these human trials were always lying down, face down on beds, because what happened was Viagra was giving them erections. And this was not expected. It was a complete accident of the trial, and then it led to this new drug, Viagra. So it's actually meant to target heart problems. Another example is this. This is the pacemaker. Wilson Greatbatch was an electrical engineering instructor, and he was building an instrument. He wanted to monitor heart sounds. So he's trying to look at sounds from the heart, and he accidentally took a transistor, and the transistor was 100 times more powerful than the ones he usually used in the instrument. And when he attached this to the instrument, he got electric pulses that were akin to a pulsed rhythm of the human heart. But this was an accident. It wasn't an intended outcome. And you look in science, in popular media, in toys, it's filled with accidents. Silly putty, the slinky are two that I can think of, Post-it notes. So this is something just to consider, that if we aren't taking risks, then we're not going to have accidents such as these ones. The thing about talking about failure is that it's integral to the scientific process. We want to fail and we want to learn about why we failed and then try it again. The popular media can be very harsh on paper retractions, but paper retractions mean that people are paying attention. Timothy Caulfield, who publishes on Public Understanding of Pseudoscience, was tweeting about that today on Twitter. And if you look at a textbook for an intro chemistry or biology class, it's really the history of biology. It's about experiments that have worked. You don't hear too much about experiments that didn't work. You might hear about something that didn't work, oh, but then it worked later. So it's the subsequent successes to failures. If we just look at those textbooks, that just teaches history of science. It doesn't teach how to do science or teach students how to fail well. So failure is integral to the scientific process. It's also important to grant funding. So this was an article that came out in 2019, and I'm showing you a snapshot of The Economist. They reworked one of these figures. I just wanted to walk you through this article. So they're looking at researchers and whether or not they received a grant. And they're zooming in on these near win or near miss applicants. So applicants that were right at the border. Some got the grant and some didn't. They were right at the border. And if you follow those applicants over time, what you see is that the near misses actually had more hit papers within 5 years and within 10 years of publication than the near win applicants. And if you look at average number of citations, that's true as well. It doesn't necessarily hold up if you look at the ones at the highest end of the spectrum of winning, but when you look at the near win and the near miss, it does. And it's just an interesting study with respect to long-term impact of not getting that first grant when you're very close to the border. But also, failure is an integral part of learning. So we talked about curiosity and motivation. And we know from curiosity metrics, the more curious you are, the less fear you tend to have from failure. We're going to come back to this again and again. I wanted to talk about some public examples. There's so many public stories of failure. Hollywood loves a good comeback story when there's a failure and then there's a success. Oprah Winfrey was fired from her job in the newsroom, and that's what encouraged her to start her talk show. She started afterwards. She's talked a lot about failure. There's lots of public quotes attributed to her with failure. Thomas Edison, inventor of the light bulb, he has been quoted and misquoted a whole bunch, but we think this quote came from him, and he says, "I've not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work." Another quote attributed to him is, how's it go? Oh, many of life's failures are people who didn't realize how close they were to success before they gave up. Steve Jobs, he founded Apple Computers, but then he was moved out of the board in the mid-1980s. He was hired back when they bought another company that he had developed. And Michael Jordan talks a lot about how many shots he's missed, how many games he's lost, how many times he was entrusted to take the final shot and he missed. And I think the number is 26. So the popular media is full of failures, but a lot of the time when you look at the story, it's about people who failed and were then successful. We don't talk a lot about people who failed and there might not have been a success after that. You can Google famous failures and you'll come up with a really long list. There's this great quote by Richard Russo. Jessica Lacey in her book, The Gift of Failure, talks about it, and the quote is, "Great books are not flawless books. All great books have errors." So one thing I want to highlight is that none of this is done alone. We're part of a large team that's trying to get students to embrace failure, learn from failure, bounce back from failure, and we're trying to do it across disciplines. I'm just going to introduce some members of our team. So Ria, Sherry, and Majid, they're looking at an intervention that was implemented in a 1,000-student first-year biology class, looking at the impact of that intervention on attitudes to failure. Megan, Clea, and Kelly, they are interviewing high school teachers on their perspectives of failure and looking at failure in the transition from high school to university and how it's taught in high schools currently. These are past students that have done scoping reviews. Kathy established a failure dictionary. There's so much pedagogical jargon when you're dealing with knowledge translation and you're trying to take all these cognitive psych principles and education psych principles and apply them to the classroom. Jargon is a barrier, so they've developed this failure-based learning dictionary. Dan is a current postdoc. He is a historian and he's looking at failure across disciplines. Does it look differently in history than it does in geography, than it does in biology, for example? Would you teach it in a different way? Would you frame it in a different way? Crystal is another postdoc, and she is looking at failure with respect to sciences, teaching students to learn to fail through the scientific method and scientific process. And Nicole, Mary, and Ken, and Jackie are all collaborators on this grant, coming across Nicole, and Mary and Ken are historians. Jackie is the manager of transition and orientation. We're really interested in failure in first year and how we can decrease the stigma of that. We're really interested in institutional change. We can talk about getting students to fail and how it's so important to learn from failures, but if you have policies that prohibit that, or strict policies with respect to grades that really decrease students' interest in failing in different forms, it can be hard to have meaningful change with that. So one thing we're doing is we have these different projects about course design. This is the busiest slide we have, so please don't worry. I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we're doing. If you look at a first year course, what could you do in terms of course design and failure? This is supported by a lot of TAs. It's also supported by grant funding. We wouldn't be able to do it without extra support. So we have activities that foster a growth mindset. We have activities that specifically counter procrastination in terms of scaffolding assignments and due dates and check-ins for students. We focus on experimental design throughout the course. Again, this is a science course, so experimental design is a touchstone. We worked with a journaling expert to create reflective failure journals. And the students engage in these throughout term and they reflect back on previous posts. Whenever students answer a question, they also document thinking. I'm going to show an example of that in a little bit. Think, pair, share. I'm also going to show an example of that in a second. That's when you answer something. The instructor knows you're probably going to get it wrong. So you get a wrong answer, and then you go to a partner, you talk about it, you think about it, and then you re-answer. So think, pair, share. And we've really been working hard on fostering community. This is something we're thinking about in the context of COVID and online education. How can we keep fostering meaningful community when we're not face-to-face? In terms of decreasing stigma, we talk about being purposefully uncomfortable, how some of the best learning occurs when we are uncomfortable. We talk about the cognitive science behind that. And we normalize failure through narrative by having professors share their own failure stories. And these are on in class when students come into class. So they'll see them at the start of every class, and we weave them through course content. Whenever there's any course content related to a failure a professor has had, we weave it through that. Some of the failures led to later successes, and some are just failures where they learned something that they could apply elsewhere, but there wasn't necessarily a subsequent success. But how do we assess this? Do we need to assess if students embrace failure? If we do, how do we do that? So we've spent a lot of time working on process, not product. How do we document thinking? How do we document an approach to problem solving? That means we have to be giving marks for this. We can't just give marks for the right answer. So marking takes longer. And then also these reflective journals are assessed as well. A new metric we're working with is this time to engage. I talked about procrastination. So if you reflect back to when you were in class, maybe it was high school, maybe it was university, were you ever sitting in class where the instructor would ask a question, and you're supposed to start working on it right away, and you pause, and you're just waiting to engage with the material? So that's that mini procrastination in class. So we have this time to engage metric where we look at the time it takes for students to meaningfully engage with something in class. Online, it seems like this time to engage is longer. So if I ask you a question and you post it in the chat, what I find online is that it's slightly longer than some of our in-class metrics. Okay, so this is going to be active, some aspects of this session. If you could all pop onto the chat, and it's set so that I'll get the response. Can you tell me the first word you think of when you read this word in front of you? So when you read the word failure, what's the first word you think of? I'm going to give you a second so that everyone can enter their word. So disappointment, sad, bad, learning, dejected, why me? These are all very similar words to what our students enter. Okay, so we have these words we think of right away. I'm going to send out a poll to you right now. So this should appear on your screen. And I want you to think that word you just entered, would it be positive, neutral, or negative? Just highlight or enter on this poll, what would that word be? Positive, neutral, or negative? And about 40 of you still need to vote. So let's give it another 5 seconds. I'm just going to share the answers with you. So 76% of you said that it had a negative connotation, that first word that you thought of. So I'm going to show you some data from class. When students first arrive on campus, these are students that have just come into campus. It's the beginning of term. It's one of the first questions we ask them. So anywhere between 70–78% of students have a negative connotation when they think of the word failure. It's interesting. That's very similar to what we just saw here in terms of 76% of you had a negative connotation. We're going to come back to this in a second. I just want to show you what some of those words are. So when you ask students, what word comes to mind when you think of failure? One of the most common ones they say is disappointment. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to end the poll. Thank you for telling me that. There we go. So now the poll should not be blocking your screen. Thanks for letting me know in the chat. So disappointment, struggle, hopeless, embarrassed. A lot of you had some of the same words. I didn't see hopeless from your words though. And there were some phrases, we asked for one word, oftentimes they would enter 2 or 3. Try again, came up a couple times as well. So we did a whole bunch of failure interventions throughout term, the course design ones that I showed you previously. And then when we asked the students at the end of term, what word comes to mind when you think of failure? There was a shift towards emphasizing words that had to do with learning. But when you ask the students what are the 3 words that come to mind, sometimes the first word would change. It would become positive, but then the later 2 are negative. It was never all positive words. So I'll just share some of the post words that students came up with. So they mentioned learning. We focused so much on failure and learning in class. Disappointment was still there. They mentioned opportunity. That wasn't in the previous answers. Embarrassed was still there in the answers. Try again was there. It's okay was there. And then a couple other words appeared that we didn't see in the pre-answers. Importance, preparation, growth. And we focused a lot again on processes of failure for science and for learning in class. So I'm going to give you another question. One thing about these learning activities is answering a question right away, even if you're not totally sure of the answer. So I'm going to put this out to you in a poll. Where does the mass go when you lose weight? Is it energy, sweat, into muscle, breath, or something else? So when we ask this question to students, we say, how sure are you of your answer? Carmen on the chat asked, can it be multiple of these? Just choose one. So try to choose the best answer. What first comes to mind? I'm going to end the poll now. 2 seconds to enter your answer. I'm going to share the results with you. And I'm going to say that A is not correct. It's not energy. And E is not correct. It's not something else. Those are the 2 most common answers. And those are the 2 most common answers students answer. And when they are engaged with this question, they can get quite frustrated because they thought it was the right answer. Then they go and talk to someone else and they enter it again. If there's someone beside you or someone else in your house, why don't you shout this question out and then enter your answer again? You know the answer is B, C, or D. So I'm just going to send this poll out again. And I want you to enter your answer. It's B, C, or D. I just noticed the poll is in a different order than the slide. Sorry about that. Sometimes that happens when we transfer them over. Someone just posted on chat that their dog is not a good partner in answering this question. Patricia, if you're not getting the poll, you might be able to just click the Zoom button that's at the bottom of your screen and it should come up. So what we see with students is they're more likely to get to the right answer after chatting with each other. And the right answer here is breath. You have to follow the carbon. We exhale carbon dioxide and you have to follow the carbon. This question was asked in the UK to physicians, kinesiologists, dietitians, and only 3% answered it correctly. This is a misconception question where we're pretty sure that students are not sure of the answer. When you first do these in class, they're quite uncomfortable, but then you ask them again and again, and they get used to finding where their knowledge ends and then learning about that point. I'm going to give you another example. Where does the mass of this tree come from? So you start with an acorn and you grow into an oak tree. Where does the mass of this tree come from? I'm going to launch the poll, so you should all see it now. Does the mass come from water, air, soil, minerals from the ground, something else? Another 3 seconds, enter your answer. So I gave you a bit of a hint because you had the previous question. But when we ask this question to students, first they'll answer water, then they'll answer minerals from the ground, then they'll answer soil, then they'll answer something else, and finally they'll come back to air. And they should all answer air because they all studied photosynthesis. In grade 9 and 10, you have to follow the carbon. Plants take in carbon dioxide and then they make sugars and starches. You have to follow the carbon. That's where the mass, the structure of the tree comes from. And so we use these questions as misconception questions, and students get really used to being wrong. It's low stakes. They're done either through clickers or a different in-class response system, but they get really used to being wrong. I talked before about diagramming student thinking. A really good way to do this is have them draw responses. And you can use platforms such as CrowdMark that allow them to be scanned and then marked online. They can draw them on their phone on certain classroom response systems. But we need them to draw things rather than just enter multiple choice questions. Can you just enter into the chat? If I asked you this question, do you think you could draw it? So what do chromosomes look like in a non-dividing cell? Let's say I say there are 4 chromosomes in a non-dividing cell. Just type yes or no. Do you think you could draw it? And I realize people are from a whole bunch of different backgrounds on this call. Some of you are describing it. That's wonderful. And some of you are absolutely right. So students, you say, hey, could you draw this? They would almost all say yes. Yep, I know what this looks like. And then when you look at what they draw, usually it falls into 3 different categories. So the first one here, you have some things that look like 4 individual chromosomes. Over here, you don't have a nucleus and you have 4 X's. It's really common for students to draw chromosomes as X's in a non-dividing cell. We'll talk about why. And then you have a scribble over here, which is chromatin. And the best answer of these 3 would be the last one, the chromatin. Another way to get at this question is to divide it into 2. Okay, so draw 2 chromosomes right before they're replicated and then after they're replicated. What would those look like? When we ask students to draw them, the answers usually look something like this. So we can take all of the student responses and we can categorize them usually into these different categories. Sometimes they're joined at the centromere, sometimes they aren't, but we always see a majority of the students drawing X's. So this middle one here is the majority, and these are students that are just transferring from high school to university, and they draw X's. And the reason for that is that that's the only way they've ever seen photos taken. We take photos in metaphase. We draw the chromosome as it's condensed in metaphase because it's condensed and we can see it, but it condenses after replication. So this is a typical image that students will see. This is what they see in their textbook again and again. So they have this mental model of this X chromosome. But if we don't correct this mental model early, if they don't know it's wrong and get comfortable with being wrong, they won't understand crossing over of meiosis. They won't understand how we generate diversity through meiosis. So this is an example of one of the problematic mental models we work with. Okay, so now I'm going to do another activity about failures and how we classify failures. This is something we do with our 1,000 students in intro bio. I want you to think of a past failure, and if you feel comfortable, you can share it in the chat. So think of a past failure, and if you feel comfortable, I invite you to share it in the chat. Some of you are posting comedic answers, and some of you are posting serious answers, which is what we see with our students. Some of you are talking about failing high school math, getting a D in organic chemistry, failing English, not getting a grant, getting divorced. The last meal you cooked, you would classify as a failure. I lost my job. I failed physics. A lot of you are talking about courses, failing courses. I didn't get the job I wanted. I didn't get a fellowship. I didn't finish my PhD. I lost patience with my kids. I fell out of a handstand and I bruised my tailbone. These are all failures. They're just different types of failures. I didn't get a national scholarship from university. So these are all different types of failures. We all experience failure, and we need to normalize talking about those failures and why the failure happened. If you think about what you want students to do when they graduate, it's not memorize a list of facts. You want them to be able to ask questions, find answers, but take responsibility for doing that and take responsibility for their own learning, and failure is a part of that process. So I want to introduce you to this idea of the failure continuum. Wouldn't you say that some failures are actually bad? We have this conversation with students. I'm just going to introduce it to you. We've modified it from a business case, and we've used some different language with our students. So at one end of the failure continuum, we have poor behavior. There was poor behavior that resulted in failure. You were up all night watching Netflix and you didn't come to class at 9 a.m. Maybe that was a failure. Inattention, maybe you were on your phone in class, you didn't hear the question, so you didn't get that mark. Inexperience, like you tried hard, but you just didn't have enough background. The process had missing parts to it. You were trying hard, you were doing a process, but it had missing parts. Maybe the task was just really challenging. Maybe the process was really complex. And these things, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. With our students, we spend a lot longer going over what they are. There was uncertainty. You couldn't foresee certain future events. You made a decision based on information you had, but there was an unforeseen thing that happened. Hypothesis testing and exploratory testing. So this is a failure continuum. Now I am going to launch this poll. It's a big poll. It'll take up part of your screen. Can you just answer the failure you thought of or you entered in the chat? How would you categorize it? Was it poor behavior? Was it inexperience? Was there some uncertainty? How would you classify that failure? Wonderful. So 3 more seconds to enter your answer. Absolutely. If you can't see the poll on your computer, please enter your answer in the chat. So I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to show you what everyone's responses were. So the most common response was inexperience. And this is very similar to what we see with students, except they really cluster towards the left-hand side of this continuum. So with our students, when we ask them to give an example of a failure, and these are students, the very first example they give, okay? The majority of students, the first example they give, they will usually give examples related to poor behavior, inattention, inexperience. And what we want to do is we want to move them across this continuum to thinking about failures at the other end of the continuum. How would you engage in those types of failures? How would you learn from those failures? And again, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. It's actually more like a web when we work on it in class, because we build on it and we add layers, and students will connect failures through their failure journals to different aspects of this. Okay. So one thing we do is we really try to foster this community of failure, a community of second chances. Many assignments are built in with second chances. They're built in with scaffolding so that if you do better the second time, it replaces the earlier grade, but you have to have reached a threshold on that earlier grade, so you had to have tried to learn from it. You can't just miss it or get a 0. Part of fostering this community of failure is a narrative of failure. So we have professors who've given us quotes or stories or videos that we show before class, and we interweave it, like I said, through class. I wanted to share one example with you. Dan Riskin, he's the former co-host of Daily Planet. He's an adjunct professor in our department, and he's a bat biologist. And he comes and talks to our students about science communication and failure. And I'd just like to read his quote. While taking questions after my first talk at a scientific conference, I was basically heckled by a senior scientist in front of everyone I'd been trying to impress. For years, it made me feel like I didn't have what it takes to be a scientist. After a while, though, the sting started to wear off. Later, when I started doing TV, I found that I was much less afraid of audiences than I had been before. I think it's because I knew I'd survived the worst case scenario already. It's kind of the same. It's the same as the way you lose your fear of holding a bat once you've been bitten by one. You realize how much it will hurt, and even though you still don't want to get bitten, you're less scared. And I read this quote to my daughter, and she said, oh, maybe it's like having kids. You have the first kid, and you know it hurts, but you have another one anyways. And I said, perhaps it's similar. So we try to normalize failure and normalize learning from failure. Another way we do that is through social media and engaging social media. I encourage all of you to explore this hashtag of fieldworkfail. There are many examples of researchers that are engaged in fieldwork and things have failed. So this is an example from David Hamilton. When frillneck lizards are released, they immediately run up the nearest tallest object for safety. It's usually a tree. In this case, it was me. One example. Another example, wanted for robbery. Robber crab, prime suspect of skillful dislodging and subsequently stealing of a thermal camera. Thought to have brought it back to its lair of prized possessions. Do not get fooled by its pretty colors. So there's many posts about thermal cameras, different types of cameras going missing. And some of these have been turned into an art project. If you look at fieldworkfail.com, this is one researcher that accidentally glued herself to a crocodile while attaching a radio transmitter. And this is another researcher that accidentally spilled a pheromone solution and became the, quote, sexiest darn tanner beetle in all Skang. There are lots of examples of these. We use examples from lab, from failures in previous student labs that students have given us permission to share and how they learned from that. Failures in terms of teaching, things that we've tried that didn't work and why they didn't work. And I really like this quote from Bounceback Ferdowsi. One of my students sent me this. We asked the students to monitor social media and send us interesting narratives and to share it with the class. And he says, the way Astro Shell phrases it is that locally in the moment, failure is not an option, like Apollo 13. But we all acknowledge failure is a huge part of what we do, especially if you're like me. And that is literally your job. So he is an engineer with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, and his job is to make things fail and figure out why they fail. There's different types of failure and different points in time. We want to engage in those failures. So I'm going to leave it at that point. I'd be very happy to take any questions that you have. I will jump on to the Q&A, and you can post your questions there, or you can type them into chat. as you like.
Thanks so much, Fiona. We already have some questions lined up. If you want to pick and choose.
Absolutely. So James asked a question about igniting and continually renewing intrinsic motivation. Because motivation can be exhausting. There's one thing I forgot to mention in this presentation, which was stress. So actually, I'm going to send a poll out to you right now, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask everyone on the call, do you think students will be under more stress than usual this fall? I'd like you to answer yes or no. This is the quickest question you've answered so far. So I feel like you're very sure of your opinion. So when I've been asking this question at various workshops recently, over 90% of respondents have consistently been saying yes. And here we're at 90%, 10% exactly. I can share the results with you. When I asked the question, do you think faculty will be under more stress than usual this fall in the context of COVID? Again, more than 90% will consistently say yes. So when we think about motivation, we also have to think about stress, because whether or not there is excess levels of stress directly impacts whether there will be motivation and motivation to learn, and which low-hanging fruit will drop off first. And motivation can be one of those things. So in terms of what we do in class, I'm just going to actually, it's okay, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see, you can see my face more and others. There we are. In terms of motivation in class, a lot of it is tied to curiosity. So we try to do a lot of curiosity metrics and genuine curiosity in terms of priming students to learn. We know from data that motivation for grades does not equate to motivation for learning. And in terms of long-term recall, the motivation for learning is better than the motivation for grades. Joel just asks in the chat, can a CBT approach help learning? Yes, and there has been some publications about that. There is a workbook you can order for teens for CBT and procrastination and perfectionism that's been shown to be quite impactful. Dina posts a really interesting comment in the chat about the equity dimensions of looking at failure. Absolutely. So there's so much literature about who is allowed to fail, who is allowed to have a second chance and who isn't. And there are gender implications, racial implications, there's all sorts of structural bias implications as well. And so that's part of our conversations, because across society, not everyone has equal chance to learn from failure.
There's a question from Faria. It seems that our approach to failure is that we initially try to avoid generating errors, but prioritize learning from them when they occur. Why do you think that is, and how can we resolve this discrepancy?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I wish people had the answer to this. I think this is something that a lot of different researchers are trying to get right at right now, is that we try to avoid generating errors all the time. There has been some evidence about social media has increased this in teens and in our younger university students, this fear of generating any errors at all. So this is exactly what we're trying to get at, is that some errors are okay and some aren't, and how can we generate the ones that are okay? In a safe environment, it has to be low stakes to generate errors, especially within the context of academia. It has to be within a low stake environment to generate those errors. I love that question.
I'll disclose that I know that Faria is actively trying to find the answer to this research question, and she was probably hoping that you had an answer.
Well, we should email, because there are a whole bunch of resilience-based learning journals that we've been looking at to try to target this exactly. But it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of hands-on time. So I don't have an answer about how to do it more broadly. And as a parent of 3 young kids, I want to know this for my kids, for sure. Oh, so Alan posted a really interesting question in the chat. How do we address this as educators when the grading cadence and weight still favors stress and perfectionism? That's a great question. So coming back to the need for low stakes assessment, there should be no courses that are designed with a 40% midterm and a 60% final. It's been shown that those don't lead to long-term learning. They lead to cramming, and students might perform well and get a good grade, but a grade as a measure of performance is not always an indicator of long-term learning. So for that, we're looking at low-stakes assessment and this idea of second chances. As long as you tried on the first one, second chances. So professors on the call, do you ever have a midterm and it's sitting in your office and very few students come and pick it up to look at their feedback or look at their grade? If you do exam wrappers, it's more likely that students will pick up the midterm, and it's more likely they will actually look at the feedback and not just look at the grade. So this idea of being okay with your failure and learning with your failure is one of the first obstacles we're trying to overcome.
There's a question from Denise. I teach high school chemistry. How do I convince kids that failure is learning in progress? How do I convince the parents? And how do I convince the admin? Because now admin does not want us to fail students.
Yes. So my husband is a high school math and physics teacher. So I identify with what you're saying. We're having lots of discussions about provincial policy with respect to grading. We have to normalize it as it's not a grade. There's this other acronym out there, FAIL, first attempt in learning. And we decided to use FLIP, learning in progress, because we really want to highlight that failure isn't just one step. It's something you should do repeatedly, and it's part of a longer process. So there's some literature on conversations with students and conversations with parents, and where do you want your child to get to? You want them to get to this stage where they're independent and they're a self-regulated learner and they're taking responsibility for their learning. If you emphasize where you want to get them to and the best way to get there, it's akin to the conversations we were having about evidence-based pedagogy and active learning. How do you encourage students to engage in active learning versus passive learning and sitting and listening to a lecture? You show them that they're going to do better in the long run. This is the process that you have to take. So there's some literature on process. Terry just put in the chat Carol Dweck's Not Yet. Absolutely. So Carol Dweck wrote the book Mindset, and she talks about fixed versus growth mindset. And you keep coming back to not yet. You're going to get this. You're just there. You're just not yet there. Sorry.
There's a related question. As a mom of three, what is your best advice for helping kids become critical thinkers and solution finders?
I love that question. So, yeah.
Or maybe kids that can find their own socks.
Find their own socks and their shoes when they have to get out the door. So for me, I see students when they come to university, and I'm always thinking about how am I going to help my kids succeed when they get to university? And one is be a self-regulated learner, like take responsibility for learning, be self-directed. And the other is be a critical thinker. So we try to normalize conversations around critical thinking. You can't do it with a workshop here, or they watch a video here, they watch this YouTube thing here. You have to normalize it. So it's become our dinner table conversation. Oh, I read this today. What do you think about that? We talk a lot about pseudoscience, especially in the age of COVID, wearing a mask, not wearing a mask. What's the evidence for that? Is it good evidence? We talk about Gwyneth Paltrow a little bit and lack of evidence for certain things that are sold through her website. Again, Timothy Caulfield, you can find him on Twitter, publishes on that a lot about public understanding of pseudoscience. So my best advice there would be to normalize the conversation. It can't be something you just do now and then. I saw a workshop advertised to teach kids to be critical thinkers, and that's great because it might give you some tools, but it can't be this one and done, oh, I checked it off my checklist. We have to normalize this conversation of always being critical, and it's okay to challenge something, and it's okay to say, oh, what's the evidence for that? Just like I would want my intro university students to say, you're teaching us in this way, like what's the evidence for that? Why are we doing that? And if I don't have an answer for that, then I'm not using evidence-based practice.
Question from Michelle. What are your thoughts on how strict and competitive acceptance requirements for schools, whether it's undergrad, graduate, or professional schools, and how they impact the pressure of avoiding failure within learning? What could administrators do? And I might use an ad for hiring teaching assistants.
Oh, that's such a great question. And students that apply to be part of our research program too. If we have hundreds applying, how do you choose? I guess my input would be that it is a metric, but it shouldn't be the only metric. It's a metric of performance within a certain scenario. and it shouldn't be the only metric. I recognize it's part of a greater institutional structure, and institutional change can be glacial, especially when you're talking about larger numbers. But what we try to push for is this idea of second chances. So if you fail, it's not on your permanent record. If it's going to be on your permanent record, you can't advocate for students to fail. There has to be second chances. But then we have to recognize that grade is a metric. It's not the only metric. Right now, it's a metric that has a lot of currency. So I recognize that there has to be institutional change. One of my most interesting research students I've ever had came to me, and in the interview I said, I always ask this question. I always say, hundreds of students have applied. Why should I select you? Like, what would you bring to this team? And she was quiet for a moment and thoughtful, and she said, well, I'm okay with failing. I'm going to learn from it. And this was before we had really started a bunch of this work. And she was just talking about how she's okay with making mistakes. And I had never had that answer before. It was really interesting. And I took her on as a research student.
Tamara asked, do activities where there is a share element with peers, as in think, pair, share, do you think that reduces the fear of failure, or at least helps students embrace it? Is that part of the process? That's
a great question. So yes, when you're normalizing failure, when you're showing the results to the class and you say, 80% of you said you were sure of this answer, but only 5% of you got it right. Like, there's some sort of disconnect here. Let's figure out what's going on with the class. And you normalize the failure, and then you get them together. So I would say absolutely. There's some evidence for that in terms of decreasing stigma. One of the first steps is to normalize failure in a group. But it's important to share that almost the entire class got it wrong. It's not just you. So you don't go into the group thinking you're the only one that got it wrong.
Okay, and then related to that, can you elaborate on the failure journals that you mentioned and how they help to shift students to the right side of that failure continuum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, we created these failure journals to highlight that failure is a process. It's not just something that happens once. It's valuable, but it's only valuable if you reflect on it. So we have a time bar of the course, and we visibly show where they are in the course and what's happening with the failure journal, and we refer back to things that have happened before. Right now we are adapting it to this sort of interactive, it's not a board game. I don't like the word board game. I have to think of a different word because I don't want to gamify it too much, but it's this roadmap, so to speak, of the course where you can go into different aspects of the failure journal and it'll pull up, oh, this is what you said before. Look how it compares now. So it pulls up and prompts you to do that comparison. For example, what are the first 3 words that come to mind when you hear the word risk? What's the first 3 words that come to mind when you hear procrastination? Oftentimes the first word they say is me when you ask them that. Another is, what are the first 3 words you think of when you think of yourself? And then you ask them, which of those 3 words will help you succeed in this course? And if there isn't one, what word would you add? So we have a lot of questions that are structured like that. The students are resistant to do it at first, but then once they see how it fits into the course, they buy into it and they're really engaged with it.
How about in a situation where you have typically in an introductory level course where you have a huge discrepancy in the background knowledge on course content and preparation and experiences? How do you find the failure sweet spot?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question, especially when you have such a diverse classroom and people are coming into your classroom with incredibly diverse experiences. We have refugees that are new to Canada that have just landed in Canada and are still orienting them to themselves to their space and culture here and other changes. That's such a great question. I don't know what the answer is. I can say what we do. What we do is we share student experiences and we try to normalize difference between everyone, that everyone's at a different spot. Everyone knows a different amount and you have to figure out where the edge of your knowledge is. So that example I gave you about the X drawing chromosomes like X's, maybe you don't have that mental model, but maybe people do. Mm-hmm. And so we do a lot of crowdsourcing activities for community building. At the beginning of term, we'll get students to enter, what's your superpower? Like, what can you do that people don't know you can do? And we'll share this list with the students, and there's 1,000 answers, and it's amazing things that students in class can do. But we'll also generate lists of, like, right now at this moment, what's your greatest fear? And we'll share that list all shared anonymously with the class, and things like, I know my mom is going to die in a few weeks, or I am not prepared for class. That's one of the most common answers. And when students see that so many people feel the exact same way, it helps to build connection. So I realize that's not an answer to your question, but it's something that we try to do.
I think like modeling failure yourself, and so for example, like I've been teaching introductory psychology for a number of years now, and I can almost anticipate most of the questions I get, but my favorite questions are questions that are original or I don't know the answer. And my favorite thing to tell someone is, I don't know. That is such a great question. I wonder if someone's actually researched this. This could be like even an original research question that I think you should look into, like drop by my office hours. And like, those are moments I really embrace. And
I love those moments too. I love those questions.
okay, I think just in the interest of time, we'll have one more question. And then we're going to give some details on a final activity that we're going to do that's called a pub quiz to see how well you've been paying attention to tonight's lecture. So the final question I have is from Thomas Marlin. How do you grade a progression of trial and learning? I've seen students not try the first time unless it's graded.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about this. You have to assign, so grades have currency to students. They will only engage in something if they see the value. And if they aren't yet seeing the value of learning, then you have to use grades. And so we see a shift over term about how important students see certain activities, whether or not they have grades attached. So they're all low stakes assessments. They're not worth very much, but collectively they're worth a lot. So because grades have this currency, we use grades until students are aware of how important they are to the learning process. And if you haven't tried at this activity, you don't get that second chance. So you have to try the first time, which reinforces evidence-based pedagogy and the whole idea of retrieval practice.
Thank you, Fiona, so much for such an engaging lecture that spurred so many questions. We still have a number of questions remaining, but you know, these people have to get to breakfast tomorrow morning, so we don't have time to get to all the questions. We are going to conclude with one final activity after a brief break. So at 8:15, we will commence with our pub quiz in lieu of our reception that typically follows our keynote. So if you go to the website crowdper.com, and if you look at your alumni email, there's a direct link on the email you received at 6 o'clock, and enter the code ZHPG4. We are going to have a 10-question pub quiz based on the information presented tonight. And did I mention there are prizes? The Alumni Association of McMaster University is providing $600 worth of Uber Eats gift cards for those who answer most accurately and the quickest. So we're going to take a 7-minute break. Please head on over to crowdper.com, enter your name, your email, and the code ZHPG4, and then Fiona, Maureen, and myself, we will be back to ask you these questions, and we will see if you're following along on the CrowdPer website in real time where you stand relative to everyone else to see if you're in the hunt for one.
And Joe, we're still keeping Zoom open, right? So they can
and
stay
Zoom
on.
will be open, so we'll be reading the questions aloud on Zoom. Great. So at 8:15, so you have about 6 minutes if you have to go for a quick break or get yourself set up on the website. We have 94 players who are ready to join us and get going. So the questions are going to be read by the three of us, and we have an order here. After the question is read aloud, Connie will release it on CrowdPer, and then you'll be graded for how quickly and how accurately you answer. And then you'll be able to see the standings after each question. Okay, so we're going to go with our first question to Maureen.
Okay, but before we begin, in the spirit of this lecture, I think we should just say failure is okay. If you don't know the answer to these questions, that's all part of the process, right?
That's fair.
Okay, the first question is, the Eurovision Song Contest was canceled for the first time in how many years this year? The option A is 24 years, option B is 44 years, and option C is 64 years. I see a few of you have watched on Netflix the Eurovision Song Contest movie with Will Ferrell. Yeah, I have 3 teenage boys. We watched that recently. Don't worry, if you haven't seen it yet, you're not missing a lot.
Okay, here we go with question number 2. Let's see if you were paying attention to the whole lecture. What has Maureen converted into the Dean's office for the McMaster Faculty of Science? The garden shed, her son's bedroom, the dining room table, or the basement? And the correct answer was her son's bedroom. Very good.
Okay, so the next question is on to me. So who said this quote? "I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that do not work." Was it A, Winston Churchill, B, Thomas Edison, C, Steve Jobs, or D, Michael Jordan?
And the correct response was?
B, Thomas Edison.
Thomas Edison. Excellent.
Okay, the next question is, all of these medical discoveries which of these medical discoveries happened by accident? A, Viagra, B, aspirin, C, Tylenol, or D, antihistamines?
And the correct response?
A, Viagra.
Very good. Okay, our next question. Which of these things is not a learning myth? Multitasking works, learning styles exist, we only use 10% of our brain, testing helps us learn. And I'm hopeful everyone got this correct. The correct answer is D, testing helps us learn.
And that's why we're doing this pub quiz, right, Joe?
Exactly.
Exactly. So the next question, which of these things is not an example of evidence-based medicine? A, taking aspirin to prevent a heart attack, B, homeopathy, C, putting ice on a sprained ankle, D, vaccinations to prevent communicable diseases. You have 5 seconds. And the right answer is B, homeopathy.
Now, Joe, I think Connie wants us to pause here so that she can share the leaderboard. I'm not watching on CrowdPer, so do you want to let me know when,
Sure.
when you want me to proceed?
All right, let's bring up that. Okay, so you see the rankings there. Okay. I don't recognize anyone, but good luck to everyone. Still in the running. Okay.
Okay. When students are asked what word they think of when they hear the word failure, that word is usually A, positive, B, neutral, or C, negative? And the correct answer is C, negative.
We are down to our final 3 questions. Okay, this is one that I did not know. Where does the mass go when you lose weight? Energy, sweat, into muscle, breath, or something else? Tamara says, follow the carbon into your breath. Thank you very much.
And so the next question, where does the mass of a tree come from? Does it come from water, air, soil, minerals, or something else? Ten seconds. And the answer is air, because you have to follow the carbon in the carbon dioxide.
That could be a t-shirt. Follow the carbon.
So this is the last question to me then.
The very last one.
Okay, so this is the very last question. Along the quote failure continuum, how would most students classify their failures at the start of term? Is it A, poor behavior, inattention and experience, B, uncertainty, process complexity, C, hypothesis testing, exploratory testing? Five seconds. And the answer is A, poor behavior, inattention, and inexperience.
And here is our final leaderboard. Looks like our winner is Terry. Congratulations to Terry. So if you have registered with your email, we will contact the winners and send you, oh, that's Terry McCurdy. Congratulations. Send you the gift cards from Uber Eats. I want to thank our question readers, Fiona and Maureen, and thank everyone for joining us this evening and ending a wonderful and insightful day 1 to the EdCog conference. I hope everyone can join us tomorrow morning at 9:15 for day 2 of the EdCog conference. Thank you and good night.